So it was June of 1999. It was the hottest time of the year in India. And I was 7 years old. And right across our house is a river called the Brahmaputra. It's about 4 miles wide, really, really big river. And I remember that summer it was so hot that we would have to shower 3 times a day. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once right before going to bed. Because you'd sweat so much and it gets sticky, and we didn't have AC, so you'd shower 3 times a day. And I remember one night, before going to bed, I looked up and I just prayed to God, God, will you open up the heavens and just bring down rain like never before, so that this dry, hot land would cool down, and so that I wouldn't have to shower so many times a day. Man, I should have never prayed that prayer. Because the next morning I remember waking up, and what do I see? My parents are waddling in like 3 feet of water in the house. And there's shoes floating, clothes floating, my toothbrush is floating. The fish from the river is now in the house. It has become an aquarium. And I remember I see my favorite He-Man toy just floating. And I grab it. And I remember I see my Nintendo 64 floating, and I grab it. And I remember seeing my math homework floating, and I didn't grab that one. And yeah, it rained all night, which flooded the river, which flooded our house. And overnight, about 100 or more than 100 people lost their homes due to the untamable nature and chaos of a storm and the forgettable prayer of a 7-year-old boy. We are in our series called Meeting Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And today in our passage this morning, we will see Jesus and his disciples meet the untamable power of the storm. Will you open up with me to Luke chapter 8, verse 22? We will have it on the screen as well. Luke chapter 8, verse 22. Let's read. One day he got into a boat with his disciples. He said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they put out. Verse 23. And while they were sailing, he fell asleep. A windstorm swept down on the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. So it's in the middle of the night, it's quiet, it's calm. Jesus falls asleep on the boat. He's tired, he's exhausted, he's been preaching and teaching all day to the crowd in Galilee. And so Jesus is tired, the disciples are getting sleepy, some of them have probably fallen asleep, and suddenly the wind picks up. And not too far from them, they see a storm approaching fiercely towards them. Before we keep going, I just want to mention that the Sea of Galilee is about 700 feet below sea level. There's mountains and hills all around. Some of the mountains go up to about 2,000 feet. And so the cold air from these mountains descends, and when it mixes with the warm air from the sea, it produces some of the nastiest and violent storms. And this is a common thing that happened 2,000 years ago, and it still happens to this day. So by this point, the water is filling up the boat, and the disciples are petrified, they're panicking, and they look to their only source of help, Jesus, their master. And what do they see? He's asleep, he's passed out cold. Amazing. In the city of Mumbai, in India, there's about 2,500 trains that carry about 7.5 million commuters every single day. And if you ever ride one of those jam-packed trains, you will notice, or one of the things that will fascinate you, which fascinates me even to this day, is that for a lot of those daily commuters, as soon as they get into the train, they just fall asleep. Like, even if it's tight, even if it's sweaty, even if it's humid, and there's like tons of people, they still fall asleep, whether that's leaning, standing, or sitting. But what's interesting is that they never miss their stop. So let me explain. So I'm sitting in the train, and a man walks in who's supposed to get out at the sixth stop. So we get to the first stop. This man's getting comfortable. He gets on his seat. He finds a seat and sits down. Second stop, his eyes are starting to get heavy. Third stop, this man has fallen asleep. Fourth stop, he's leaning against the person next to him. Fifth stop, at this point, this person is snoring. And I'm here panicking that this man's going to miss his stop. But as soon as we reach to the sixth stop, something just jolts him. And he gets up, he looks out of the window, recognizes it's his stop, and he just walks out. While I'm still in the train, about to have a panic attack. Mumbai commuters have this mystical, internal alarm clock that tells them, hey, it's time to wake up. But we know that Jesus wasn't a commuter from Mumbai because he doesn't get up when he clearly should. He doesn't get up when his disciples are about to die and drown. Verse 24, they went to him and woke him up, shouting, Master, Master, we are perishing. In Mark's account, it even says that the disciples woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Before we move on, let me just say one thing. A storm is anything and everything that will make us question God's love for us. A storm is anything and everything that will make us question God's love for us. The storm that the disciples faced that night made them question if Jesus, their master, truly cared about them. You see, the disciples were seasoned fishermen, and facing a storm was part of life. It was part of their job. And these disciples have faced hundreds of storms throughout their life, storms of every kind, storms of every magnitude, storms of every height, breadth, depth, and intensity. But on this night, the storm they faced was beyond their courage. On this night, the storm they faced was beyond their faith. On this night, the storm they faced was beyond their trust that Jesus cared about them. So they shout, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Teacher, don't you care that we are drowning here? Church, have you asked the same question recently? Have you asked God this same question recently? Because just like the disciples, the storm in our lives will make us question, God, do you even care if I drown? Because right now, in this moment, you seem non-existent at worst and asleep at best. God, do you see me drowning here in the midst of a raging storm, and I'm doing all I can to not be swallowed up by the sea, to not be swept away by the wind. I'm scared to drown, God, but I don't think I can hold on any much longer. God, do you not see that I'm drowning here? Why are you asleep? Why are your eyes closed? Don't you care that I'm dying here, God? Have you asked that question recently? Because in the midst of the storm, for these disciples, it looked like Jesus was asleep. In the midst of the fiercest of storm that the disciples had ever faced, Jesus was asleep. So what happens next? Luke tells us, verse 24, and he woke up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves. They ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, where is your faith? So Jesus gets up, he wakes up, not by the sounds of the winds and the waves, but the cries of his disciples. It is not the chaos around Jesus that wakes him, but the cries, the helpless cries of his disciples. Why is that? I mean, surely the sound of the winds and the waves were much louder than the cries of his disciples, right? But for Jesus, the cries of his disciples mattered more than anything else. Jesus is especially attentive to the cries of his people. Jesus is especially attentive to our cries. Jesus heard them in the midst of the storm, and it woke him up. And he stands up and he rebukes the wind, saying, "Peace, be still." And the raging waves and the wind stopped immediately. Not gradually, but it stopped immediately. The sea became smooth as silk, still as glass, from chaos to calm, from panic to peace. Jesus then gets up and turns to his disciples and asks them, "Where is your faith?" Which is a really odd question. Jesus asked his disciples in the midst of, right after calming the storm, "Where is your faith?" What is Jesus trying to say when he asked the question, "Where is your faith?" First, let's begin with what he's not saying, what Jesus is not saying. First, what Jesus is not saying that faith itself can prevent storms. That if they had faith, there wouldn't be a storm. Jesus is not saying that if they believed more, prayed more, gave more, served more, read the Bible more, that there wouldn't be a storm. Secondly, what Jesus is not saying is that faith itself can calm storms. That if the disciples could just muster up enough courage and belief, that they could have stilled the storm themselves. So Jesus is not saying that faith can prevent storms, nor is he saying that faith itself can calm storms, but rather what Jesus is saying is that faith brings peace in the midst of the storm. Because even in the fiercest of storms, there is no safer place to be than in the presence of Jesus. This summer during COVID, I experienced a significant loss. I was overwhelmed by grief and pain. And I remember I experienced depression for the very first time in my life, severe depression for the very first time in my life. Because I have friends who would tell me what it feels like, the weight of depression. And I would walk with youths that I mentored that would tell me what it felt like, but I never really understood them until it happened to me. And I remember throughout the morning and all day long, all I would do is look at my watch and hope and pray and beg that the hands on my watch would just move faster so that the sun would set, it would get dark, and it would be time to sleep so that I could just forget everything, only to wake up at 3 a.m. every single day, all alone, while the whole world is asleep. And I remember there was this one afternoon, felt like my chest was about to explode, like I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I was about to have a panic attack, and I knew that I had to just get out of the house. I just couldn't be in the house. I knew I had to go out. And so what I do is I grab a bike, Sadie's bike, and I just ride. I didn't know where, but I knew I just had to go. And I remember rode for miles. I got to the Bosque Trail and kept riding. And by this point, I'm covered with tears and snot. And the people passing me are probably thinking, "Man, this dude is really into biking." I reach an intersection. I take the wrong turn. It comes to a dead end. I had to turn around. And I remember I was so frustrated at that moment, and I just had to cry out. I cried out, "God, where are you? God, did you bring me halfway across the world, away from my home, away from family? God, did you bring me halfway across the world to leave me like this? God, where are you? Because right now in this moment, I feel so alone. Right now in this moment, I don't see you. God, why are you asleep?" And I remember There was a strong wind. I stopped, I braked, and I stopped my bike. And I heard his voice say, Toshi, I am with you right here, right now. And you are exactly where you're supposed to be. You are home. But I replied, but God, home is being in the comfort of my family. And he responded, no, home is not where comfort is, but home is where my mission is. And my mission for your life is right here, right now in Albuquerque. And I promise you, Toshi, I will be with you all the way through till the very end. It was so freeing. Felt the joy and presence of Jesus like I've never felt in such a long, long time. And I guarantee you the storm was still there. The storm was still around me. I could see it. I felt it. But I felt peace in that moment. Because in that moment, I recognized that being with Jesus in the boat, in the storm, was safer than being on dry land without Him. In that moment, I recognized that being with Jesus in the boat, in the storm, was the safest place I could be, more than the comfort of being on dry land without Him. Church, if Jesus is with you in the boat, in the storm, it is the safest place you can be. So when Jesus asked His disciples, where is your faith? He's asking them, do you not see that I am in the boat with you? And if I am in the boat with you, then it is the safest place you can be. Being with Jesus in the boat is the safest place we can be. Verse 25, the disciples were afraid and amazed and said to one another, who is this then, that He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey Him? What's weird about this story, if you guys notice, is that before Jesus calms the storm, the disciples were afraid. Before Jesus calms the storm, the disciples were afraid, which is expected, right? They were afraid to die. They were afraid to drown. But what's unexpected is that after Jesus calms the storm, they were still afraid. In the book of Mark, it even says they were no longer afraid, but now they were terrified. They were terrified of Jesus. Why were the disciples still afraid? Why were the disciples no longer just afraid, but terrified of Jesus after He calmed the storm? You see, in the ancient world, large bodies of water, seas and oceans, were believed to be the home of evil spirits. And for the disciples and other first century Jews, they knew that the seas and the waters represent a chaotic aspect of creation that only God, only Yahweh God, had the power to subdue. We see this in Genesis, in the creation narrative, where God separates land from water. In other words, order from chaos. And the disciples knew this, that only God had the power to subdue the forces of nature. And so up to this point in Luke, and up to this point in our story, the disciples saw Jesus as teacher, they saw Him as wise, they saw Him as a rabbi, they saw Jesus as a prophet, some of them even saw Jesus as Messiah, the Savior that is to come. However, that night, in the storm, for the very first time, the disciples finally saw Jesus as God Himself, because they knew that only God had the power to subdue the forces of nature. And they were terrified because they knew that the creator of the winds and the waves, the one who spoke creation into existence, is now here with them in the boat. Church, who is Jesus to you? Who is Jesus to you? Just like the disciples, most of the time, we're fine with Jesus the teacher. We are fine with Jesus the healer. We are fine with Jesus the brother, the friend, the motivator, the therapist, the matchmaker, the political advisor, and maybe even Jesus the Messiah, the Savior. But Jesus as Lord? To have Jesus as King? Jesus as God Himself? That's scary. Because if you truly acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, then what it means is that your career, your relationships, your savings, your retirement plans, your future, your dreams, your comfort, not just one area of your life, but all of life is under His rule and reign. And it's scary. Because if you say Jesus is King, then He just might ask you more than what you're willing to give Him. If you say Jesus is King, if you call Jesus King, then He just might ask you more than what you're willing to give Him. But church, if you surrender what was never really yours in the first place, and if you laid at the feet of King Jesus, then He will set you free from the chaos and pressures and expectations of the kingdom of this world. When Jesus asks you for more than you can give, if you lay it at His feet, He will set you free. So I ask again, church, who is Jesus? Is He Lord? Is He King? Is He God Himself? What's interesting about this story, to close up, what's interesting about this story is that there's a story that is very, very similar to this story in the Old Testament. The story of Jonah in the storm is strikingly parallel to the story of Jesus and His disciples in the storm. In the book of Jonah, Jonah gets into a boat. He falls asleep. There is a storm. And the people wake him up saying, "We are going to die." In the story of Jesus and His disciples, Jesus gets into a boat. He falls asleep. There is a fierce storm, and the people wake him up saying, "We are going to die." Both stories are similar. Both stories are identical, except for just one difference. In Jonah's story, he tells the people in the boat, "Throw me into the sea. If I die, you will survive. If I perish, you will live." And the sailors threw him into the sea. But that doesn't happen in Jesus' story, right? Or does it? If we look ahead in the story of Jesus, we remember that this is not the only storm that Jesus faces. There was an ultimate storm. The storm that was first stirred in the garden with Adam's rebellion against God and has been multiplying over the history of mankind. This is the ultimate storm that will cause not just a temporal perishing, but an eternal one. Just like Jonah, Jesus knew that the storm of such magnitude would not be quenched until the guilty one is plunged into the sea. While Jonah tried to run away from the storm, Jesus went head-on straight into it. On the cross, Jesus plunged himself into the raging waves. He was swallowed up by the sea. The weight of our sin that would have crushed you and me has been put on His shoulders. And with arms stretched out, with His dying breath, He said, "It is finished." And with that, He broke this curse of death and sin once and for all. From panic to peace, from chaos to calm, the ultimate storm was made still once and for all. Church, friends, brothers, sisters, on the cross, Jesus faced the ultimate storm for you and for me. On the cross, Jesus faced the ultimate storm on your behalf, on my behalf. And if He didn't abandon you in that ultimate storm, then you can rest assured today that He is with you right here, right now, in your storm, in your boat. And it's the safest place you can be. Do you trust Him? Will you trust Him? Let's pray.